Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So today's video is the video I have promised you last week, and we're going to be talking about what potentially can happen in the UK if we go into the conflict. Whether you follow the news or not, you probably be aware there's a lot of things that are happening, a lot of articles about, a lot of information about, to basically tell us that UK is unfortunately preparing for the conflict. At the same time, we had a lot of articles telling us to prepare for certain things, some of them including the missiles and some of them including the grey zone attacks. At the same time, there is tons and tons of videos out there that seem to be a little bit fearful. They're telling us that if the UK goes into the conflict, it's going to be full out war. And this is where I think I slightly disagree, because generally, as we've been told as well, the attacks on the UK, if we enter the conflict, will be more sort of a grey zone attack. By grey zone attack, I'm talking about the attacks on infrastructure, sabotage, basically to destabilize the country and panic the population. Yes, there are a lot of outlets there telling you that yes, of course, we should be preparing for full-out war with the nukes and things flying about. But this is, I don't believe, is going to be happening. And in fact, that the chances are very unlikely. So what is likely is, like we're talking about, is the grey zone attacks, drones, that sort of thing. So in today's video, guys, we're going to be looking at the list of things that potentially could be happening in the UK if this were to happen. The information or the knowledge, in fact, comes from, for the past few years and generally from the history, what has happened in the UK in the case of the emergencies. So guys, it's not going to be scary, but it's going to be basic things, because, you know, some people think that the life stops because country enters the conflict, but it could not be further from the truth. There are people right now living in the conflict zones and they still have to continue with their daily life like nothing is going on. So guys, without further ado, let's kick off with the video. So in front of me, guys, I've got the some bullet points and the list of categories that we're going to briefly cover. I'm going to try to make it easy to understand, and it's very straightforward because, well, in fact, it is actually very straightforward, but I feel it's very important for us to aware and know this, what potential scenario is going to be, so we can prepare for this a little bit better. So number one, we're talking about the government and the emergency responses. So first things first, the government will activate a COBRA, which is the Cabinet Office Briefing Rooms. It's something that they have as a crisis management system. So they basically get a group of very important people together so they can quickly act on what is currently happening. Next thing, we're talking about the emergency alerts. We already know that we already have this on majority of our phones. So I know they're already currently activated. And of course, we're talking about potentially the sirens. I thought all the sirens in UK have been deactivated, or in fact don't actually exist, but I've been told that there are some sirens still available. So things like that will be activated, put back into place. And of course, the first thing or the last thing will be a military deployment. This is kind of goes without saying. So now we're talking about the civilian restrictions. So we're just talking about me and you as the people. So potentially, I've got number one is the curfew or the movement limits. So we're talking about pretty much similar things to what happened in 2020, where we are restricted to either specific zones or specific times, all of course depending on the type or the severity of the conflict or the zones of the conflict. But something like that is probably highly likely, especially around the area of the military interest, if I can call it that. Talking about the border closures and checks, so things like the travel restrictions or passport travel restrictions will be probably rather limited. And again, to some extent, I would imagine that traveling even throughout the country or from Wales to England or to Scotland potentially might not be allowed or very limited. Again, it is all depending. And talking about the emergency legislation, so the government might decide to bring out certain rules and regulations, like they did again in the 2020 time, when they suddenly decided what could be done or could not be done, whether you could sit on a bench or not. We're not talking about this kind of extreme, but things we're talking about the potentially restriction of the fuel, that potentially can block the social media, and of course that could bring in something to do with the food rationing or the amount you can buy, that sort of thing. Right, going on to then is the schools and childcare. Again, people seem to assume that if something happens, then the schools will be closed. Well, it's very, very unlikely. Things will still continue. The schools are still be open. Okay, there could be restrictions depending on the area. In some area, the schools might be closed because they're close to, again, the military points or, points of interest, if you wish. But generally, I expect that to be still operational. Things like the remote learning, they might introduce that for older children or in universities. Again, like something we have seen before, because, well, the less people on the road, generally they'll say safer if you are at the house or in the home doing whatever you're doing. And then of course things like the mental health, anxiety in children, if again depending of how the severity of the situation is, something like that will have to be implemented again as a potentially part of curriculum to teach kids to understand a little bit better what's happening, or maybe even how to prepare. So next thing, we're talking about the work. Again, life doesn't stop, so people will still have to go to work like they did during World War II. It's just, life just goes on. The only thing, again, potentially could happen is the remote working. Again, we've seen this in the 2020. It was almost like a pre-test run of things that potentially could be happening, but they encourage people to work from home, or in fact it could be mandatory for people to work from home. And then of course, like we've seen before, the on-site people for essential roles like NHS, police, all sorts of kinds of personnel will be have to be being on site pretty much all the time. Again, it's a speculation, but it is kind of something that's been happening before, we already know. Again, next one is a call up of the reservists. So if you have the reserve army or even the NHS, again, when they're trying to get people from the retirement, so the companies will have to force to let go of those people who are in employment to go into the army if the government says so. And of course, comes with the job insecurity generally. Again, it's depending on the severity of the things that are happening, but we've seen that, again, I refer this to the 2020, where a lot of businesses closed down that possibly couldn't sustain the lack of people, the lack of business. So again, the chances are, if something were to happen and we're restricted on the amount of times we'll be going out, of course, there will be financial issues as well. So chances are that non-key businesses will basically just shut down or go bankrupt. So next thing, we're moving on to supply chain and generally shopping. So first of all will be, okay, and this is, we're talking about the very first instant, is panic buying. We've already seen this time and time again. It happens all the time, but I can assure you it's going to be probably 10 times worth or 100 times worth if people find out that potentially we're entering the conflict. So originally people will be sweeping up the very basics and very essential items. Then we're talking about the disruption of imports. We rely on imports on a lot of things, including the fuel, medicines and food. So again, we're talking about the potential ports. Again, okay, ports are one of the potential targets. Okay, be it even the cyber attacks, like we've seen this on the ships and on many things. So having the attacks on the ports will cause potentially the issues, not just with food, but with the medicine and the fuel. So this is where potentially then government may bring out one of their rules or legislations about the rationing of fuel, like it was happening in the World War II. There was rationing on the fuel, so basically there was enough fuel to supply to the army and that sort of thing. And another thing we're talking about is the medicine. First of all, just the access to the medicine, especially the one that's currently imported, potentially will be an issue, if at all, might not be possible to get whatsoever. And then of course we're talking about the operations on people. So non-essential operations will be halted or cancelled. And again, we've seen this all time and time again. So next thing we're going to be talking about is the food availability and rationing. Again, I should have put them the other way around with the economy, but nonetheless, right, the food, okay, again, the scarcity of food, the panic buying, it comes without saying, but at the same time, also the price hikes are very possible, because what's going to be happening in the economy during that time. Rationing, okay, it's really more so in this slightly extreme scenario, okay, if they cannot get any food, if maybe the conflict is a little bit more than just, cyber warfare, that sort of thing. But rationing, it's very possible, okay? And I actually had some of you messaging me before saying that apparently the UK already ordered some rationing books. I don't know whether that's true or not. I haven't seen any of that information. Not that I assume is going to be available kind of on the public eye, but this is something that I've been told. So the things like rationing, we're talking about the meat, dairy, cooking oil, baby formula, and obviously the fuel and power. At the same time, but all the digital thing, we're potentially talking about the digital allocation of the a Russian's book, if that makes sense, because they can control, they can control what you purchase through your cards, believe this or not. So there could be somewhat of a digital control or a digital Russian book. So now we're talking about the finance and economy. So next one, we're talking about the banks. So potentially thinking about the bank limits or closures of the banks. Could be temporary limits on the ATM cash withdrawals, or they totally can ban the cash withdrawal, or depending. This is if the banks stay open. There's a possibility banks could shut down for a period of time. It is all depending on the scenario. Stock market crash, it is absolutely goes without saying. We see any tiny bits happening even in the different countries and an effect. So stock markets will be crashing probably for quite a while, and of course then makes our pound very much unstable. That's at the same time as well will cause price hikes on many things. And then the last one I've got is the public spending control. So again, it's going to be either emergency budget to ramp up some more money to support the conflict, or there's such a thing as called the war bonds. It's basically where the government can borrow money from average citizens to pay for the conflict by this means, rather than basically hiking up the interest to a stupendous rate. So next thing we're going on is the cyber and information warfare. So again, cyber attacks. We're talking about the power grid, NHS, even the supermarkets. Okay, we've seen it all. Literally, there was even a cyber attack on MOD the end of last year. All the information leaked of a lot of army personnel with their phones, their addresses, all that kind of information has been leaked. So this is a very possible, okay? They could even target the financial system or the banks. So this is where when we talked about the banks and limited the availability of the cash, that sort of thing, because, well, if the banks are targeted, all of them at the same time, then it's going to be a little bit of the trouble. Misinformation surge, of course, this happens all the time, and I'm not going to be pointing fingers or names on any news outlets there, but every time there is a conflict happening, there's going to be somebody there trying to induce some news, fake news or sabotage. And I'm talking about on the big level, okay, on the big level of the big news outlets or the government, that sort of thing. So this is very much possible. Things like the communicational blackouts. Again, it could happen for many reasons. Things like cyber attacks, sabotage. Again, we've seen this all just in the space of a 6 months time. Things, again, if we're talking about the preparedness, we'll cover this differently, but say the loss of the internet, loss of phone signal, it also comes with the drones. You know, some people think, well, the drones flying about, you may not see them, you hear them, but it might not have an effect at all. But with the electronic warfare, you might suddenly find yourself, if there's a bunch of drones flying around or approaching your area, you will lose your phone signal and the internet without notice, just like that. And chances are you wouldn't even know how long that's staying for, and it could last for a good couple of weeks. And this is of course only dependent on specific territory where the potential drones are flying about. So it's a very interesting point, but it's very easy to be missed because people sort of dismiss that sort of thing. But the point is, it's just far more than just a cyber attacks that could affect your internet and the phone signal. Then of course we're talking about generally the general behavior of the people. So again, rising fear and confusion, and we're talking about especially for unprepared people. And I understand, I think in any other case, if something like this happens, however little the incidents are, people will be scared, people will be unsure what's happening, because even with the government trying to drip feed some information there, it's natural, we're human beings. If something's happening, something that's not stable, it's gonna make people really upset. And I also obviously put down in some instances, we talk about the looting, if, all dependent on the severity of the food availability, what's currently happening, behavior of people generally on your streets, generally everywhere, but looting happens quite often. So preparedness for that would be quite important. Community resilience, again, it all depends. See, during the 2020 time, again, people came together. Okay, and people helped in some instances when they could come together and help each other, help your neighbors, elderly neighbors, that sort of thing. That kind of happened, okay? And it could work out this way, but at the same time, it could totally go the opposite way. And it all depends on the scenario, and it all depends who lives around you. But two chances, it can either really work really well and people stick together, again, like they did during the war, or it could be all going to pot, unfortunately. And of course, the last one, talking about the community, is the search of volunteers. Again, if there are people that be prepared to do this, then people that want to help out, then there will be search of people wanting to help, whether it's be it NHS or be it the army or be it any other way. Because again, there already has been plans to create what they call like a dead army, people sort of governing or patrolling a certain areas of interest, if you wish, or military interest. It's already kind of been put out there in the making, so this is a highly likely that is going to be happening. So there we are, guys. This was my list of things that could potentially happen if we go into the conflict. As I said, this was based on the grey zone conflict. And again, all of the things that I pointed out to you, this is something we have already experienced in the previous emergency situation. So the chances are of this progressing the same way are very much likely. And I totally know there will be a lot of information out there. People think that, you know, or people trying to tell you, well, if we are going to the war, it's going to be, you know, things flying around and that's it, that's the end now, you know, take your bag and go hide in the forest from the missiles. It is not what it is likely to be. And I know many people will agree with me. This is just the basic scenario, how the things are currently progressing. This is what's more likely to happen. So as on following in from this video, I will be doing a video how to prepare for war. And I say war, I don't like to use that word, but how to prepare for the conflict. And of course, in a general manner, we're just going to go through a few of the things that are going to tell you how we can possibly prepare ourselves for what's potentially coming our way, but hopefully not. So there we are, guys. Well, hopefully you have enjoyed this video. Please don't forget, thumbs up, subscribe if you're not a subscriber, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye bye.